The fluorescent lights of Chicago General Hospital's emergency waiting room flickered with the rhythm of a dying heartbeat. I sat hunched over in a plastic chair that had seen better decades. My son Tommy pressed against my side, his small hand clutching the fabric of my worn jacket like it was the only thing keeping him tethered to earth. My lungs felt like they were wrapped in barbed wire, each breath a battle I was slowly losing. The inhaler in my purse had stopped working an hour ago, the cheap generic medication no match for the worst asthma attack I'd had in years. But the triage nurse had looked at the waiting room full of gunshot wounds and heart attacks and told me it would be at least 3 hours. 3 hours I wasn't sure I had. "Mommy, you're making that sound again," Tommy whispered, his 7-year-old voice tight with the kind of fear no child should have to feel. The wheezing sound that escaped my throat with each labored breath had gotten worse in the past 10 minutes. "I'm okay, baby," I lied, forcing the words past the constriction in my chest. My vision swam at the edges, black spots dancing like malevolent fireflies. "Just need to wait our turn." But even as I said it, I knew I was running out of time. The tightness in my chest had progressed beyond uncomfortable into genuinely terrifying territory. Each breath felt like trying to suck air through a straw that kept getting smaller. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Tommy's fingers dug into my arm. "Mommy, your lips are turning blue." I touched them with trembling fingers and felt the coldness there, the lack of oxygen turning my extremities the color of a winter sky. Panic clawed at my throat, making the breathing even harder. This was it. This was how I was going to die, in a hospital waiting room with my son watching, because I couldn't afford the expensive medication my pulmonologist had prescribed. Because 3 months ago, when my ex-husband Marcus had beaten me so badly that 2 ribs cracked, the stress had triggered a cascade of health problems that my minimum wage job at the diner and my bare-bones insurance couldn't begin to cover. Because I'd made the mistake of loving the wrong man, and now my 7-year-old son was going to watch his mother suffocate in a room full of people, too busy to notice one more struggling woman in a city that ate people like me for breakfast. "I need to get help," Tommy said suddenly, his voice taking on a determined edge that reminded me painfully of the man I'd divorced, the strength that had attracted me to Marcus before it had curdled into violence. "No, baby, don't leave," I started, but he was already on his feet, his small frame darting through the crowded waiting room with the single-minded purpose of a child on a mission. I tried to stand, to follow him, but the room tilted sideways and I collapsed back into the chair, my vision tunneling to a pinpoint. Through the haze, I could hear Tommy's voice, high and desperate, calling out to someone. Then everything went dark. 15 minutes earlier, Dante Caruso had not planned to spend his Wednesday evening in a hospital emergency room. He had planned to finalize the acquisition of 3 properties on the South Side, territories that would expand his family's legitimate real estate holdings while providing convenient locations for the less legitimate aspects of their business operations. But his sister Gabriella had called with that particular tone of voice that meant she was about to ask for something he couldn't refuse, and now here he was, waiting while she got stitches for the cut on her hand. She'd earned trying to prove she could open a wine bottle with a corkscrew while simultaneously arguing with her boyfriend on speakerphone. "You know, for someone who runs half of Chicago's underground, you're red. Remarkably soft when it comes to your baby sister," Vincent, his consigliere and closest friend, observed from the chair beside him. Vincent's expensive suit looked as out of place in the shabby waiting room as Dante's own custom-tailored charcoal ensemble. "She's the only family I have left who isn't trying to undermine me or take what's mine," Dante replied, his voice carrying the particular wariness that came from managing an empire built on fear and respect in equal measure. "I'll indulge her occasionally." At 38, Dante had spent the better part of 2 decades consolidating power in the Caruso family, transforming them from mid-tier operators into one of the most formidable organizations in the Midwest. He'd done it through a combination of strategic brilliance, calculated ruthlessness, and an almost supernatural ability to read people and situations. He'd also done it alone. His father had died when Dante was 20, leaving him to navigate treacherous family politics, while fending off rivals who saw his youth as weakness. His mother had followed 5 years later, her heart giving out under the stress of the life her husband had chosen. And Gabriella, 16 years his junior, had been the one bright spot in a world that had grown progressively darker with each passing year. He checked his watch, an understated Patek Philippe that cost more than most of the cars in the hospital parking lot. Gabriella had been back there for 40 minutes. How long did it take to stitch up a minor laceration? That's when he heard it. A small voice, desperate and terrified, cutting through the ambient noise of the waiting room like a knife. "Please, someone, please help. My mommy can't breathe." Dante's head turned automatically toward the sound. His instincts honed by years of danger always alert to distress signals. A little boy, maybe 7 or 8 years old, stood in the middle of the waiting room, tears streaming down his face as he looked around frantically at the other occupants. The child wore clothes that had been washed so many times they'd faded to ghosts of their original colors. His sneakers had holes in the toes, but his face, twisted with desperate fear, was beautiful in the way children's faces were before life had a chance to mark them. "My mommy's lips are blue and she won't wake up and nobody's helping and she's going to die." The boy's voice climbed higher with each word, hysteria creeping in at the edges. The triage nurse glanced up from her computer, her expression weary and unmoved. "Sweetie, everyone here is waiting. Your mom will be seen when she's going to die." The boy screamed, and something in his voice, the absolute certainty of catastrophic loss, made Dante's chest tighten in a way he hadn't felt in years. Before he'd consciously decided to move, Dante was on his feet, crossing the waiting room with the predatory grace that made lesser men step out of his path instinctively. Vincent followed a half-step behind, his hand automatically moving inside his jacket, where Dante knew he kept a 9mm Beretta. The boy's eyes locked onto Dante as he approached, and perhaps the child saw something in Dante's face, some flicker of authority, or power, or simply the willingness to act, because his small hand shot out and grabbed Dante's sleeve with desperate strength. "Please," the boy sobbed, his fingers twisting in the expensive fabric. "Please save my mommy. She can't breathe. Nobody will help us. Please." Dante looked down at the child, at the tears cutting tracks through the dirt on his face, at the hope and terror warring in his eyes, and felt something crack open inside his chest. Some carefully constructed wall that kept the world at arm's length, that allowed him to make impossible decisions without flinching. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. "Where is she?" Dante asked, his voice quiet, but carrying absolute authority. The boy didn't hesitate, pulling Dante across the waiting room to a corner, where a woman slumped in a chair, her head lolled to one side. Even from several feet away, Dante could hear the terrible wheezing sound of her breathing, could see the blue tinge to her lips that spoke of oxygen deprivation. She was younger than he'd expected, maybe late 20s, with dark hair that fell in tangled waves around a face that might have been pretty if it wasn't currently the color of old newspaper. She wore the uniform of Chicago's working poor. Faded jeans, a thin jacket, shoes that had been repaired more than once. And she was dying. "Vincent," Dante said sharply, his mind already moving through options with the speed that had kept him alive, in a business where hesitation meant death. "Get a doctor. Now. I don't care if you have to drag one out of surgery." Vincent was already moving, his hand on his phone, his voice carrying the day, a particular tone that meant someone was about to have a very bad day if they didn't comply immediately. Dante knelt beside the woman, his expensive pants pressing against the dirty hospital floor without hesitation. Up close, he could see the fine tremors running through her body, the shallow, desperate attempts to pull air into lungs that had stopped cooperating. "What's your mother's name?" he asked the boy, whose hand had transferred from Dante's sleeve to the back of his jacket, still holding on like Dante was the last solid thing in a liquefying world. "Sarah," the boy whispered. "Sarah Mitchell. I'm Tommy." "Tommy, I need you to listen to me very carefully," Dante said, meeting the child's eyes with the full force of his attention. "Your mother is going to be okay. Do you understand me? I'm going to make sure she's okay." It was a promise he had no business making, a commitment that might prove impossible to keep, but something about the way Tommy looked at him, with absolute faith in the authority Dante projected, made it necessary. "You promise?" Tommy asked, his voice small and broken. "I promise," Dante replied, and felt the weight of that promise settle onto his shoulders like a physical thing. Vincent returned at a run, accompanied by a doctor in scrubs who looked harassed and annoyed until his eyes landed on Dante. Whatever the doctor saw in Dante's face made his expression shift from annoyance to something approaching fear. "This woman is in respiratory distress," Dante said, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of absolute command. "She requires immediate intervention. You will provide it. Am I clear?" The doctor, wisely, didn't argue. Within seconds, he was barking orders to nurses who appeared with a wheelchair and oxygen equipment. They transferred Sarah's limp form with professional efficiency, and Dante watched as the blue tinge to her lips began to fade under the flow of pure oxygen. "Sir, are you family?" one of the nurses asked, clipboard at the ready. "We need insurance information. Consent forms. I'm covering all expenses," Dante interrupted, pulling out a card that bore the name of his legitimate holding company. "Private room. Whatever treatment she requires. Bill everything to this account." The nurse's eyes widened as she looked at the card, recognition flickering across her face. Anyone who'd lived in Chicago for more than a year knew the name Caruso, even if they pretended not to understand what it really meant. "Yes, sir," she said quickly. "Right away, sir." As they began wheeling Sarah toward the treatment area, Tommy's hand tightened on Dante's jacket again. "Where are they taking her?" "To help her breathe," Dante replied, placing a hand on the boy's shoulder. "You did the right thing, asking for help. You may have saved your mother's life." Tommy looked up at him with eyes that were too old for his young face, eyes that had seen too much hardship and understood too well how precarious their dire position in the world really was. "Will you come with us? Please? I don't want to be alone if..." He couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't voice the fear that his mother might not make it despite the oxygen and the doctors and Dante's promise. Dante should have said no, should have handed the boy off to hospital staff and returned to his own business, his own problems, his own carefully constructed life, where he didn't make promises to desperate children in hospital waiting rooms. Instead, he found himself saying, "I'll stay." Vincent caught his eye, one eyebrow raised in a question that carried volumes. Dante gave him a barely perceptible nod, and Vincent immediately understood. Call the meeting. Reschedule. Whatever was happening here took precedence. Because Dante Caruso, who had killed men without losing sleep, who had built an empire on the broken bodies of those who opposed him, who had learned to cauterize his emotions until he felt nothing but cold calculation, found himself unable to walk away from a 7-year-old boy, with dirt on his face and holes in his shoes, who'd grabbed his sleeve and begged him to save someone. As they followed Sarah's wheelchair deeper into the hospital, Tommy's small hand found Dante's and held on tight. And Dante, who hadn't held anyone's hand in more years than he could remember, squeezed back. He had no idea what he was walking into. No idea how this one moment of compassion would unravel the careful threads of his controlled existence. No idea that the woman currently fighting for breath on the gurney ahead of them would become the axis around which his entire world would pivot. All he knew was that he'd made a promise to a child who reminded him painfully of himself at that age, desperate and alone, and convinced the world was a place where hope went to die. And Dante Caruso never broke his promises. The private room they'd secured for Sarah Mitchell was a far cry from the emergency department's chaos. Dante had insisted on the cardiac care unit, where the nurse-to-patient ratio was higher and the monitoring more intensive. It had required a phone call to the hospital administrator and a donation that would fund a new pediatric wing. But within an hour, Sarah had been transferred to a space where she could receive the level of care her condition demanded. Now Dante stood by the window, watching the Chicago skyline glitter in the darkness. While behind him, Tommy sat in a chair, pulled up to his mother's bedside, his small hand wrapped around her much larger one. Sarah's breathing had stabilized under the oxygen mask. The blue tinge faded from her lips, replaced by a healthier pink. The cocktail of medications they'd administered, bronchodilators and corticosteroids, had begun to reverse the acute attack. But even unconscious, she looked fragile in a way that made something protective stir in Dante's chest. "Mr. Caruso," Vincent said quietly from the doorway. "We have a situation." Dante glanced at Tommy, who was murmuring something to his unconscious mother, then stepped into the hallway where Vincent waited with a tablet in hand. "Talk to me," Dante said. "I had Marco run a background check on Sarah Mitchell," Vincent began. pulling up information on the tablet. 28 years old. Divorced 6 months ago from Marcus Mitchell, a piece of work with a record that includes assault, domestic violence, and DUI. She filed a restraining order 4 months ago, after he put her in the hospital with cracked ribs and a concussion. Dante's jaw tightened, his hands curling into fists at his sides. Where is he now? That's where it gets interesting, Vincent continued, swiping to another screen. Marcus Mitchell was arrested 2 months ago for violating the restraining order. He made bail, courtesy of Tony Romano. The name sent a cold shot of recognition through Dante's system. Tony Romano ran operations for the Lombardi family, second-tier players who'd been making noise lately. He's about expanding into Caruso territory. Why would the Lombardis bail out a lowlife like Mitchell? Dante asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Best guess? They found out his ex-wife witnessed something she shouldn't have. There was an incident at the diner where she works, Rosie's on West Madison. A meeting between Romano and some of his associates that got heated. Sarah was working that night. Marco's still pulling security footage, but it looks like she might have been in the wrong place at the wrong time. Dante processed this information with the cold calculation that had served him well for 2 decades. A vulnerable woman with a violent ex-husband connected to a rival organization, a child caught in the crossfire, and now Dante himself, inserted into the situation by an accident of compassion. Where's Mitchell now? He asked. Vincent's smile was thin and predatory. We're tracking him. He's been spotted near her apartment building twice in the past week. Seems he's waiting for an opportunity. Put surveillance on both the apartment and the hospital, Dante ordered. I want to know if he so much as looks in this direction, and find out what exactly Sarah Mitchell saw at that diner. If the Lombardis think she's a problem, we need to know why. Boss, Vincent said carefully. With respect, we don't know these people. Getting involved in whatever mess she's caught up in could complicate things with the Lombardis at a time when we're trying to negotiate new territory agreements. It was good advice. Practical advice. The kind of advice Dante usually took without hesitation, because emotion had no place in the business of running a criminal empire. But then he thought of Tommy's small hand in his, of the desperate plea in the boy's voice, of the promise he'd made. Find out everything, Dante said, his tone making it clear the discussion was over. I want a complete picture by morning. Vincent nodded, recognizing when further argument would be pointless, and disappeared down the hallway to make the necessary calls. Dante returned to the room to find Tommy still sitting vigil, but now the boy's eyes had closed, his head resting against the edge of the bed, exhaustion finally claiming him. A nurse entered quietly to check Sarah's vitals, her movements efficient and practiced. She smiled at Dante with the particular kind of deference hospital staff showed to wealthy benefactors. She's responding well to treatment, the nurse reported softly. The attending physician believes she'll regain consciousness within the hour. We've adjusted her medication protocol to prevent future attacks, though she'll need to follow up with a pulmonologist for long-term management. Arrange the follow-up, Dante said. Best specialist in the city. And I want her prescriptions sent to a pharmacy that will deliver here before she's discharged. The nurse nodded, making notes on her tablet. Of course, Mr. Caruso. Is there anything else you need? Dante looked at Tommy, at the way the boy's thin frame seemed even smaller in sleep, at the worn clothes and scuffed shoes that spoke of poverty Dante had left behind so long ago, he'd almost forgotten what it felt like. Bring food, he said. Real food, not hospital cafeteria material. Chicken soup, bread, something a child would find comforting. And coffee. Strong. Right away, sir. As she left, Dante pulled up another chair and sat down, positioning himself where he could watch both Sarah and Tommy, as well as keep an eye on the door. Old habits from a life where letting your guard down meant death. He should leave. Should go back to his own concerns. His own empire. His own carefully compartmentalized existence. But something kept him rooted in that chair, watching a woman he didn't know fight her way back from the edge, while her son slept with the exhausted trust of a child who'd been carrying too much weight for too long. Sarah stirred about 40 minutes later, her eyes fluttering open beneath the oxygen mask. For a moment, confusion clouded her features as she took in the unfamiliar surroundings, the medical equipment, the private room that was several degrees of luxury above what her insurance would typically cover. Then her gaze found Tommy, sleeping at her bedside, and relief flooded across her face with such naked emotion that Dante felt something twist in his chest. Her eyes moved to Dante next, taking in his presence with a mix of confusion and wariness that told him she was used to male strangers being threats rather than salvation. He stood slowly, keeping his movements careful and non-threatening. "Don't try to talk yet," he said quietly. "You're in Chicago General, Cardiac Care Unit. You had a severe asthma attack. The doctors have stabilized you, but you need to rest." Sarah's hand moved to the oxygen mask, questions clear in her eyes even if she couldn't voice them yet. "Your son Tommy found me in the waiting room," Dante continued, moving closer but maintaining a respectful distance. "He asked me to help you, so I did." Tears welled in Sarah's eyes, spilling over to track down her temples. She looked at Tommy again, at her brave, terrified son who'd somehow found the courage to grab a stranger and beg for help. The nurse returned with food, setting a tray on the bedside table. The smell of chicken soup filled the room, and Tommy's eyes blinked open, immediate panic crossing his face, until he saw his mother awake. "Mommy!" He was on his feet in an instant, careful not to disturb the medical equipment as he pressed close to her side. "You're okay. The man promised you'd be okay, and you are." Sarah pulled off the oxygen mask with shaking hands. "Baby." Her voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper, but filled with love and relief. "Are you all right?" "I'm okay," Tommy assured her. "The man helped us. He made the doctors come, and he got you this nice room, and he stayed with me the whole time, even though you were scared." Sarah's eyes moved back to Dante, assessment and gratitude warring with obvious confusion about who he was and why he'd done any of this. Who she started, but her voice gave out. The effort of speaking too much for vocal cords strained by hours of labored breathing. Dante pulled a card from his pocket, one of the ones that listed only his name and a phone number, without the business affiliations that would tell her exactly who and what he was. He set it on the bedside table, within her reach but not forcing her to take it. "My name is Dante Caruso," he said simply. "The hospital has my information for all expenses. Focus on recovering." Recognition flickered in Sarah's eyes at the name Caruso, and Dante saw the moment she made the connection, saw wariness shift into something closer to fear. She knew who he was, or at least knew enough to understand that his help came with complications she probably couldn't afford. "I can't," she started, but Dante raised a hand gently. "We'll talk about it later," he said. "When you're stronger. For now, eat something. Tommy, make sure your mother has some of this soup." He was moving toward the door when Sarah's hoarse voice stopped him. "Thank you," she whispered, and the sincerity in those two words carried more weight than any amount of money or power or respect Dante had accumulated over his lifetime. He nodded once, then stepped into the hallway where Vincent waited with updates that would pull him back into the world of territory disputes and family politics and violence that was his normal existence. But as he walked away from that hospital room, Dante Caruso found himself already planning his return, already thinking about the threats facing Sarah and Tommy Mitchell, already calculating how to keep the promise he'd made to a desperate 7-year-old boy. He'd just inserted himself into something far more complicated than a simple act of charity. He'd declared his protection over a woman who was apparently caught up in Lombardi business, making her safety his concern, and therefore his problem. Sarah was discharged 2 days later with a prescription regimen that would have bankrupted her in a week if Dante hadn't arranged for everything to be billed to an account she had no access to and couldn't refuse without seeming ungrateful. She'd tried, of course. Tried to explain that she couldn't accept charity from a man whose name carried the weight of violence and criminal enterprise. Tried to insist she'd find a way to pay him back, though they both knew her wages from the diner wouldn't cover even a fraction of the medical costs he'd absorbed. But Dante had simply looked at her with those dark, penetrating eyes and said, "Your son saved your life by asking for help. The debt, if there is one, is mine for being in a position to provide it." And then he'd left before she could argue further, leaving behind only his card and instructions to call if she needed anything. Anything. As if Sarah Mitchell, single mother working double shifts just to keep a roof over their heads, could ever call a man like Dante Caruso for anything. Now, 3 days after returning home to their modest apartment, in a building where the heat worked intermittently, and the locks were more suggestion than security, Sarah stood at the window of their third-floor walk-up, watching the street below with the paranoid vigilance that had become second nature since Marcus had started violating the restraining order. She'd seen him twice this week. Once across the street from the diner, watching through the window with that particular expression that meant he was planning something. Once in the parking lot of Tommy's school, close enough that the principal had called to ask if there was a problem, if they needed to alert the authorities. The authorities. Sarah would have laughed if her chest didn't still ache from the asthma attack. The police had done nothing when Marcus put her in the hospital. They'd filed reports, documented injuries, issued a restraining order that was apparently just an interesting piece of paper Marcus liked to ignore. "Mommy, is the bad man outside again?" Tommy's voice came from behind her, small and frightened in a way that broke her heart. Sarah turned from the window, forcing a smile she didn't feel. "No, baby. I'm just looking at the sunset." It was a lie. The sunset was happening on the other side of the building, but Tommy was 7 and traumatized enough without adding to his burden. "You're a bad liar," Tommy said with the brutal honesty of childhood. "You've been watching for him ever since we got home from the hospital." Sarah crossed the room and pulled her son into a hug, breathing in the scent of the cheap shampoo they used and the distinctive little boy smell of dirt and innocence. "I'm just being careful. That's what moms do." "The man at the hospital, Mr. Caruso. He said you'd be okay. He promised." Tommy pulled back to look at her with those 2 old eyes. "Do you think he could make the bad man go away too?" The question sent ice through Sarah's veins. "Tommy, Mr. Caruso helped us at the hospital, but we can't ask him for anything else. He's a very busy man with his own life. But he gave you his card. He said to call if we needed anything. That's just something people say, baby." They don't really mean the sound of footsteps on the stairs outside their apartment door cut her off. Heavy footsteps, multiple sets, moving with purpose toward their floor. Sarah's heart rate kicked into overdrive, her newly functioning lungs suddenly working too hard again. She moved Tommy behind her instinctively, positioning herself between her son and whatever was coming. The footsteps stopped outside their door. A moment of silence that stretched like taffy. Then a knock, authoritative and demanding. "Sarah Mitchell," a male voice called through the door. "We need to talk to you about something you saw." Not the police. The tone was wrong, the phrasing too informal. Sarah's hands shook as she reached for her phone. Marcus's number half-dialed before she remembered that her ex-husband was more likely to be with whoever was on the other side of that door than to help her. "I don't know what you're talking about," she called back, proud that her voice only shook slightly. "Please leave or I'll call the police." A laugh from the other side, cruel and amused. "The police can't help you, sweetheart. You saw something at the diner last week. A conversation you weren't supposed to hear. We need to make sure you understand the importance of forgetting what you saw." The diner. Sarah's mind raced, trying to remember what they were referring to. She'd served so many customers, witnessed so many conversations she'd learned to tune out because survival in her neighborhood meant knowing when to be deaf and blind. But then she remembered. The booth in the corner. 3 men, in expensive suites, voices raised in anger. One of them had grabbed another's collar, threatened him with graphic specificity about what would happen if money wasn't delivered by Friday. She'd been refilling coffee. They'd gone silent when they noticed her, but not before she'd heard enough. Names, amounts, the location of a warehouse on the south side, and one of them, the one doing the threatening, had made eye contact with her, had seen the recognition in her face that she'd heard more than she should have. "I don't remember anything," Sarah called through the door, pulling Tommy closer. "I serve a lot of people. I don't listen to conversations." "That's good," the voice replied. "That's real good. But just to make sure you keep not remembering, we're going to come in there and have a more detailed conversation about the importance of forgetting." The doorknob rattled. They were testing the lock, and Sarah's cheap deadbolt wouldn't hold more than 30 seconds against someone. Determined. Tommy whimpered against her side, and Sarah's mind went blank with pure maternal panic. She couldn't protect him, couldn't fight off multiple grown men, couldn't run because they were 3 flights up and there was no back exit. Her phone, still in her hand. And on the screen, Dante Caruso's number, already half-dialed from when she'd been trying to call Marcus. It was insane. She barely knew him, had no right to drag him into her mess. But as the door shook under a more violent impact, as Tommy's whimpers turned to silent tears, Sarah's fingers moved without conscious thought. She completed the call. It rang once, twice. On the third ring, a deep voice answered. Sarah. Not a question. He knew it was her, had apparently programmed her number into his phone during those 2 days at the hospital. There are men outside my door, Sarah whispered, hating how her voice shook. They're trying to get in. They say I saw something at the diner. I'm sorry, I know I shouldn't call, but Tommy. Address. Dante interrupted, his voice carrying a controlled fury that was somehow more frightening than the men trying to break down her door. Now, Sarah rattled off the address, then added, 3rd floor apartment Trassi. But Dante, they're about to break through. Barricade the door with whatever you can. Keep Tommy away from windows. I'm 8 minutes out. 8 minutes might as well have been 8 hours. The door shook again, harder this time, and Sarah heard the splintering sound of cheap wood beginning to give way. But Dante's voice came through the phone again, steady and commanding. Sarah, listen to me. You're going to be okay. Do you hear me? You and Tommy are going to be fine. I need you to stay on the line with me. She grabbed the small couch, shoving it against the door with strength born of desperation. Okay, I'm here. Good. Now tell me about the men at the diner. What exactly did you hear? He was keeping her talking, keeping her focused on something other than the terror. Sarah understood the tactic even as she appreciated it. 3 men. One was doing most of the talking, threatening the others about money, a delivery, something about a warehouse on South Halsted. She kept her voice low, moving with Tommy toward the bedroom, the only other room in their tiny apartment. I didn't mean to listen. I was just doing my job. I know, Dante's voice was soothing even as she could hear him talking to someone else in the background, issuing orders in rapid-fire Italian. You did nothing wrong. The men outside your door. Can you see them? Sarah risked a glance through the peephole. 3 men, one of them holding what looked like a crowbar. The door shuddered under another impact. 3 of them. One has a crowbar. Dante, I don't think the door will hold much longer. 6 minutes, he replied, and she could hear the sound of a car engine revving, the screech of tires. I need you to move Tommy into the bathroom. Lock the door. There should be a window. It's too small. We can't fit through. You don't need to fit through. You need to be ready to break it and scream if they get through the bedroom door before I arrive. Make noise, Sarah. Make as much noise as possible. Wake up your neighbors. The apartment door gave way with a crash that made Tommy scream. Sarah grabbed her son, sprinting for the bathroom as heavy footsteps thundered into their home. Come on out, sweetheart. The voice called closer now, inside her sanctuary. We just want to talk. Make this easy on yourself and the kid. Sarah slammed the bathroom door, throwing the flimsy lock. Tommy was crying openly now, and she pulled him close, phone still pressed to her ear. They're inside, she whispered to Dante. They're in the apartment. 4 minutes, he replied, his voice containing such cold fury that Sarah almost pitied the men on the other side of the door. You're doing great, Sarah. Hold on. Just hold on. The bathroom door shook under an impact. These men weren't being subtle anymore, weren't worried about noise or neighbors or consequences. Last chance, the voice called. Come out now. We have a civilized conversation. Make us break this door down. Things get a lot less friendly. Sarah looked at Tommy, at his terrified face, at the future she'd fought so hard to build for him, crumbling around them. She thought about the diner, about the conversation she'd overheard, about how witnessing the wrong thing at the wrong time could destroy everything. I'm sorry, she whispered, though she wasn't sure if she was talking to Dante or Tommy or the universe itself. The bathroom door splintered, and then, from somewhere below, she heard it, squealing tires, care doors slamming, and Dante's voice, no longer coming through the phone but echoing up the stairwell with the force of divine wrath. If anyone in this building touches that woman or her son, I will personally make sure you spend the last moments of your bathas, life begging for death. The words were spoken with such absolute authority, such certainty of violence to come, that the man who'd been about to kick through the bathroom door actually hesitated. Footsteps pounded up the stairs. Many footsteps, moving with military precision. Through the splintered bathroom door, Sarah saw her apartment fill with men in dark suits, weapons drawn, moving with the coordinated efficiency of a tactical team. The three men who'd broken into her home were on the floor within seconds, hands behind their backs, faces pressed against her worn carpet. And then Dante was there, filling the doorway of the bathroom, his expensive suit somehow still immaculate despite whatever violence he'd just orchestrated. His dark eyes swept over her, and Tommy, cataloging injuries, assessing threats. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice gentler than she'd ever heard it. Sarah shook her head, not trusting her voice. Tommy, though, pulled away from her and threw himself at Dante, with the abandon of a child who'd found salvation. "You came," Tommy sobbed into Dante's suit. "You promised Mommy would be okay, and you came." Dante's arms came around the boy automatically, one large hand cradling the back of Tommy's head with surprising tenderness. Over her son's head, his eyes met Sarah's, and she saw something there that made her breath catch. Protection, possession, promise. "I always keep my promises," Dante said, still holding her gaze. Always. They couldn't stay in the apartment. That much was clear even before Dante's men had finished restraining the intruders. The door was destroyed, the cheap lock now completely useless, and whoever had sent these men would simply send more. "Pack what you need," Dante instructed, his tone brooking no argument. "Enough for a few days. You're coming with me." Sarah wanted to protest, wanted to insist she could handle this herself, that she didn't need to be swept up into whatever world Dante Caruso inhabited. But the splintered doors and her son's tear-stained face made those protests die in her throat. "Where are we going?" she asked instead, moving to the bedroom to grab the essentials. "Somewhere safe," Dante replied. He was on his phone, speaking rapid Italian to someone, his free hand still resting on Tommy's shoulder. "Somewhere these people can't reach you." One of Dante's men, a tall, lean figure with sharp features and shrewd eyes, appeared in the bedroom doorway as Sarah was stuffing clothes into a duffel bag. "Boss wants me to help," he said, his tone respectful but assessing. "I'm Vincent. You met me briefly at the hospital." Sarah nodded, remembering the man who'd appeared and disappeared at Dante's side like a well-dressed shadow. "I can manage." "I'm sure you can," Vincent agreed. "But we're on a timeline. The Lombardis will know their guys failed within the hour. We need you and the boy secured before they send reinforcements." The Lombardis. The name meant nothing to Sarah, but the way Vincent said it, with a mixture of contempt and wariness, told her everything she needed to know about the people who wanted her silence. "Why?" Sarah asked, pausing in her frantic packing. "Why does Dante care what happens to us? We're nobody. This isn't his problem." Vincent's expression shifted, something that might have been respect or amusement flickering across his features. "You grabbed his attention. That makes you his concern. And when the boss decides something is his concern, heaven and hell couldn't change his mind." It wasn't exactly reassuring. Being claimed as a concern by a Mafia boss wasn't something Sarah had ever imagined for herself. But as she looked at the splintered bathroom door, at the evidence of how close she and Tommy had come to something far worse than questions, she found herself grateful for Dante's inexplicable investment in their welfare. 15 minutes later, they were in the back of a black SUV, with windows tinted so dark Sarah could barely see the city passing by. Tommy sat pressed against her side, his small hand clutching hers, while Dante occupied the seat across from them, his phone continuously buzzing with updates he handled with terse efficiency. "The men who broke into your apartment work for the Lombardi family," Dante explained without Sarah having to ask. "They're second-tier players trying to move up by expanding into territories that don't belong to them. What you overheard at the diner was Tony Romano, their primary enforcer, threatening his own people over a stolen shipment." Sarah processed this information, understanding dawning. "They think I'll testify, that I'll go to the police with what I heard." "They think you're a loose end," Dante corrected. "And the Lombardis have a very permanent way of dealing with loose ends." The casual way he discussed murder made Sarah's stomach churn. This was the world she'd entered, whether she wanted to or not. A world where witnessing a conversation could sign your death warrant. "Where are you taking us?" she asked again, more firmly this time. "My home," Dante replied. "It's secure. Gated, guarded, impossible to access without my permission. You and Tommy will stay there until this situation is resolved." "Resolved how?" Sarah pressed. "They're not just going to forget about me." Dante's smile was cold and promised violence. No, they won't forget. But by the time I'm finished, they'll be too busy dealing with their own problems to remember why you were ever a concern. The SUV pulled through an ornate iron gate, continuing up a long driveway lined with mature trees. Even in the darkness, Sarah could tell the property was massive, the kind of estate that existed in a different economic universe than her third-floor walk-up. The house, when it came into view, took her breath away. 3 stories of elegant stone and glass, lit from within, with warm light that made it look like something from a fairy tale rather than the fortress it undoubtedly was. Wow, Tommy breathed, pressing his face against the window. Do you live here all by yourself? I live here with my sister Gabriella, Dante replied, and staff who help maintain the property. You'll meet them tomorrow. Tonight, you need rest. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The interior of the house matched the exterior's elegance. Marble floors, crystal chandelier, artwork that Sarah suspected might be authentic rather than the prints she was used to. Everything spoke of wealth so vast it became almost abstract. A woman appeared from one of the adjoining rooms, younger than Dante, by what looked like 15 or 20 years, with the same dark hair and striking features. She wore designer loungewear and an expression of frank curiosity as she took in Sarah and Tommy. Gabriella, Dante said by way of introduction. This is Sarah Mitchell and her son Tommy. They'll be staying with us for a while. Gabriella's eyebrows rose, questions clear in her gaze, but she smiled warmly at Tommy. Well, hello there. Are you hungry? I was just about to raid the kitchen for ice cream. Tommy looked at Sarah for permission, and she nodded, grateful for the distraction. As Gabriella led Tommy toward what she assumed was the kitchen, chattering about the 17 different flavors in the freezer, Sarah found herself alone with Dante in the grand foyer. You didn't have to do this, she said quietly. We could have gone to a shelter. Or a shelter wouldn't protect you from the Lombardis. Dante interrupted. This will. No one gets through that gate without my permission. No one enters this house without being vetted by my security team. Here, you're safe. But for how long? Sarah asked, the exhaustion and terror of the evening finally catching up with her. I can't hide forever. I have a job, bills to pay, a life. Your life almost ended tonight, Dante said, his voice hardening. If I'd been 5 minutes later, if your door had given way sooner, we'd be having a very different conversation. Or more likely, we wouldn't be having any conversation at all. The blunt truth of his words hit her like a slap. Sarah sunk onto a nearby bench, her legs suddenly unable to support her weight. Dante moved closer, kneeling so they were at eye level. I made your son a promise. I intend to keep it. That means ensuring both of you remain alive and safe. The logistics of your job and bills can be handled. What can't be handled is bringing you back from the dead. Why do you care? Sarah whispered, searching his face for answers. You don't know us. We're nothing to you. Something flickered in Dante's dark eyes, emotion quickly suppressed but unmistakable. Your son grabbed my sleeve and begged me to save his mother. Do you understand what that means? He saw something in me, some shred of humanity he thought he could appeal to. And he was right. Dante's hand came up to cup her cheek, his touch gentle despite the violence those hands undoubtedly enacted. In my world, Sarah, acts of pure faith are rare. Children asking for help without expectation of cruelty are even rarer. Tommy reminded me that I'm more than what I've become. That's worth protecting. You're worth protecting. Sarah felt tears spill over, too exhausted to hold them back. The events of the week, the terror of the attack, the impossibility of her current situation, all crashed over her in waves she couldn't fight. Dante pulled her against his chest, his arms coming around her with surprising gentleness. And Sarah, who'd learned not to trust men, who'd fought so hard to build walls that would keep her and Tommy safe, found herself leaning into his strength. You're safe now, Dante murmured against her hair. I've got you. Both of you. Nothing's going to hurt you here. It should have felt like empty promises from a dangerous man playing savior. But in that moment, wrapped in Dante Caruso's arms in a house that cost more than she'd earn in 10 lifetimes, Sarah felt safer than she had since Marcus's first raised fist had shattered her illusions about love and protection. And that terrified her more than the men who'd broken down her door. Because safety in Dante's world came with a price she wasn't sure she could afford to pay. The bedroom Dante's housekeeper showed them to that night was larger than Sarah's entire apartment. A massive 4-poster bed dominated the space, draped in linens so fine they felt like water against her skin. Floor-to-ceiling windows looked out over the estate's grounds. And an ensuite bathroom featured a soaking tub that could easily fit 3 people. Tommy had fallen asleep almost immediately. Exhaustion finally overwhelming fear. Sarah tucked him in, smoothing his hair back from his forehead, marveling that her brave, terrified boy had somehow saved both their lives by grabbing a stranger's sleeve and begging for help. She should sleep too, should take advantage of the safety and comfort Dante had provided. But her mind raced, processing the day's events, trying to understand how her life had spiraled so completely out of control. A soft knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. When she opened it, she found Dante standing in the hallway, changed out of his suit into dark pants and a casual shirt that somehow made him seem more human, more approachable. "I wanted to check on you both before retiring," he said quietly. "Make sure you have everything you need." Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Sarah stepped into the hallway, pulling the door closed behind her so their conversation wouldn't wake Tommy. "We're fine. It's more than fine. It's overwhelming." Dante's lips quirked in something that might have been a smile. "My sister says I have a tendency toward excess. The guest rooms are no exception." They stood in the hallway, an awkward silence stretching between them. There was so much Sarah wanted to ask, so many questions about who he was, what he did, why he was really doing this. But the words stuck in her throat. "The men tonight," Dante said finally. "They mentioned your ex-husband, Marcus Mitchell." Sarah's stomach dropped. "What about him?" "He's connected to the Lombardis. Low level, just muscle, but connected. It's possible they're using him to get to you, exploiting his existing vendetta." The room tilted slightly. Marcus wasn't just her abusive ex-husband. He was working with the people who wanted her dead. "I need to sit down," Sarah whispered. Dante's hand was immediately at her elbow, guiding her to a cushioned bench along the hallway wall. He sat beside her, close but not crowding, his presence solid and grounding. "Marcus always had anger issues," Sarah said, the words tumbling out. "But I thought it was just drinking, just stress from his job. I didn't know he was involved in anything criminal." "Criminal associations often start small," Dante replied. "A favor here, some extra money there. Before you know it, you're in too deep to get out." Sarah looked at him, at this man who spoke with such authority about the criminal world. "Is that what happened to you?" She expected him to deflect, to shut down the personal question. Instead, Dante was quiet for a long moment, considering. "My father built an empire on violence and fear," he said finally. "I inherited it at 20 when he was killed by rivals. I could have walked away, started fresh somewhere else. But I had a sister to protect, territory to defend, a family name that meant something in certain circles." "So you chose this life," Sarah said softly. "I chose to survive," Dante corrected, "and survival in my world required becoming more ruthless, more strategic, more willing to make impossible choices than anyone who opposed me. I built something my father never could, transformed the Caruso name from mid-tier operators into one of the most powerful families in the Midwest." "And was it worth it?" Sarah asked. "The power, the empire, everything you had to become?" Dante's dark eyes met hers, and she saw depths of complexity there, layers of person she was only beginning to understand. "Ask me again in a few weeks. Right now, I'm questioning choices I've made for 20 years. "Because of us?" Sarah whispered. "Because of Tommy and me? Because of the reminder that there are still things worth protecting that have nothing to do with territory or profit or fear." His hand found hers, fingers intertwining gently. "You make me remember what it felt like before I cauterized every soft part of myself." The intimacy of the moment, the confession implicit in his words, made Sarah's breath catch. This was dangerous. Territory. More dangerous than the men who'd broken down her door. "Dante, I can't." She started, but he interrupted gently. "I'm not asking for anything, Sarah. Just offering protection, safety. Time for you to figure out what comes next without fear of immediate violence. He squeezed her hand. Whatever else you think might be happening here, whatever attraction or connection you feel, it doesn't obligate you to anything. But they both knew it was more complicated than that. The way he looked at her, the way her heart raced when he was near, the pull between them that had nothing to do with gratitude, and everything to do with something far more dangerous. I should sleep, Sarah said, extracting her hand from his, despite the part of her that wanted to hold on. Tomorrow will be complicated enough without adding, whatever this is. Dante nodded, rising to his feet with fluid grace. Rest. My staff will bring breakfast to your room in the morning. We'll talk then about long-term. As he turned to leave, Sarah heard herself say, Dante. He looked back, question in his eyes. Thank you. For everything. For keeping your promise to Tommy. For protecting us. She trailed off, unable to articulate the gratitude and confusion and complicated emotions swirling through her. You don't need to thank me, Dante replied softly. Just trust that I meant what I said. Nothing's going to hurt you here. I'll make sure of it. After he left, Sarah returned to the bedroom where Tommy slept peacefully, unaware of the complications and dangers surrounding them. She climbed into the luxurious bed beside her son, pulling him close, breathing in his familiar scent. They were safe. For now. In a mansion owned by a Mafia boss, who looked at her like she was something precious and breakable, and worth fighting wars over. And Sarah had no idea if that was salvation, or simply a more comfortable kind of cage. It was reckless. It was foolish. It went against every principle of cautious leadership that had kept him alive and in power for so long. And yet, when he remembered the feel of Tommy's small hand in his, the desperate plea in the boy's voice, the way Sarah had looked at her son with such fierce, protective love, even in the midst of her own crisis, Dante found he didn't regret a single decision he'd made tonight. Some promises were worth the complications they created. Some people were worth protecting, even if it meant declaring war on those who threatened them. And Sarah Mitchell, whether she knew it or not, had just become one of those people. Morning came with sunlight streaming through windows. Sarah hadn't bothered to cover, painting the elegant bedroom in shades of gold and amber. Tommy was already awake, sitting at the window seat with wide eyes, watching the estate's grounds like a child who'd stumbled into a different universe. Mommy, there's a pool, he breathed, pressing his nose against the glass. And gardens. And I think I saw a fountain with actual fish in it. Sarah joined him at the window, taking in the manicured landscape that stretched as far as she could see. It was beautiful in a way that felt almost artificial. Nature tamed and perfected by unlimited resources. A knock at the door announced breakfast, delivered by a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and an efficient manner, who introduced herself as Mrs. Chen, the head housekeeper. Mr. Caruso asked me to bring this up, she said, wheeling in a cart laden with more food than Sarah and Tommy could eat in a week. Fresh free pastries, eggs prepared 3 different ways, bacon, sausage, and juice that looked freshly squeezed. He's asked that you join him in his study when you're ready. No rush. After Mrs. Chen left, Sarah and Tommy ate in silence, punctuated by Tommy's occasional exclamations about the quality of the orange juice, or the way the scrambled eggs were so much better than what they had at home. Home. The word felt hollow now. Their apartment with its broken door and violated security wasn't home anymore. Maybe it never would be again. Tommy, Sarah said carefully, setting down her fork. We need to talk about what's happening. Her son's expression grew serious, the brief joy fading. Are we in trouble? Did we do something wrong? No, baby. We didn't do anything wrong. But there are some bad people who think I know things I shouldn't. Mr. Caruso is helping keep us safe while he figures out how to fix the problem. The bad people who broke our door? Tommy asked, his voice small. Yes, and maybe your father too. Tommy's jaw tightened, a flash of anger crossing his young face. He's not my father. Not really. Fathers don't hurt their families. The adult wisdom in his child's voice broke Sarah's heart. Tommy had seen too much, understood too much about the ugliness adults could inflict on each other. You're right, Sarah agreed quietly. He's not. And I'm going to make sure he can never hurt us again. She just had no idea how she was going to accomplish that, without becoming permanently indebted to a man whose help came wrapped in complications she couldn't begin to untangle. Dante's study was exactly what Sarah would have expected. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves. A massive desk that looked like it had been carved from a single piece of mahogany, leather furniture that had aged into buttery softness. He stood at the window when she entered, phone pressed to his ear, speaking rapid Italian. He held up one finger, indicating he'd be just a moment, then concluded the call with what sounded like curt orders. "Sarah," he greeted her, gesturing to a leather chair across from his desk. "How did you sleep?" "Better than I have in months," she admitted, settling into the chair. "Your hospitality is overwhelming. It's the least I can provide." Dante moved around the desk but didn't sit, instead leaning against it in a casual pose that somehow made him seem more dangerous rather than less. We need to discuss what happens next." Sarah braced herself. "I'm listening. The Lombardis won't stop coming after you. What you witnessed gives prosecutors leverage if you testify, and they can't risk that. Your ex-husband Marcus is their current asset, someone with existing access and motivation to eliminate the problem you represent." The clinical way he discussed her potential murder made Sarah's stomach turn. "So what are my options? Witness protection? Leave the state?" "Those are possibilities," Dante acknowledged, "but they come with their own complications. You'd be looking over your shoulder for the rest of your life. Tommy would grow up in fear, constantly moving, never able to put down roots, as opposed to what? Staying here indefinitely, dependent on your protection?" Dante's expression shifted, something intense flickering in his dark eyes. "There's another option, one that solves multiple problems simultaneously." Sarah waited, heart pounding against her ribs. "Marry." The words hung in the air between them like a physical object. Sarah stared at him, certain she'd misheard. "I'm sorry, what?" "Marry me," Dante repeated, his voice steady and certain. "A legal marriage that makes you and Tommy part of my family, under my protection officially, not just as guests in my home." Sarah stood abruptly, needing space to process what he was suggesting. "That's insane. We barely know each other. You can't just marry someone to solve a problem." "People marry for practical reasons all the time," Dante countered. "Security, immigration status, financial stability. This would be no different. This would be completely different." Sarah's voice rose despite her attempt to stay calm. "You're talking about using marriage as a weapon against the Lombardis. I'm talking about using marriage as a shield," Dante corrected. "Once you're a Caruso, any move against you becomes a move against my family. The Lombardis won't risk open war over a witness when there are easier ways to ensure your silence." "Such as?" Dante pushed off from the desk, moving closer but stopping just outside her personal space. "Such as making it clear that you're under my protection permanently, that any testimony you might give would be seen as coerced by my influence, that harming you would cost them more than any potential legal trouble you represent." Sarah's mind raced, trying to find the flaw in his logic, the trap hidden beneath what sounded almost reasonable. "And what do you get out of this arrangement? Besides the satisfaction of thwarting a rival family?" Something vulnerable flickered across Dante's face. "I get to keep my promise to your son. I get to ensure that a woman who did nothing wrong, except be in the wrong place at the wrong time, doesn't pay for it with her life." He paused. "And I get something I didn't know I was missing until Tommy grabbed my sleeve and begged me to save his mother." "What's that?" Sarah whispered. "A reason to be more than what I've become." The raw honesty in his voice, the admission of need from a man who projected nothing but control, shattered something in Sarah's carefully constructed defenses. "This is crazy," she said, but with less conviction than before. "Life is crazy," Dante replied. "The question is whether you want to face it alone and afraid, or whether you're willing to accept help that comes in an unconventional package. And what happens when the threat passes? When the Lombardis move on to other concerns, and I'm no longer in danger? Do we just get divorced and pretend this never happened?" Dante stepped closer, close enough that she could smell his cologne, could see the silver threads at his temples. "That would be up to you. The marriage could be as real, or as much a formality as you want it to be. I'm not asking for your heart, Sarah. I'm asking for the chance to protect you and Tommy in the most legally binding way possible. But you want more than that," Sarah said, reading the truth in his eyes. "Don't you?" He didn't deny it. What I want and what I'm asking for are two different things. I'm asking for a practical arrangement that benefits both of us. What I want," he reached up, his fingers brushing her cheek with aching gentleness. "What I want is something you'll have to decide you want too, without pressure or obligation or gratitude complicating the choice." Sarah's breath caught at his touch, at the heat that spread through her body at the simple contact. This was dangerous. Everything about Dante Caruso was dangerous. His world, his power, the way he looked at her like she was something precious he'd found in the wreckage of his violent life. "I need time to think," she managed. "Take all the time you need," Dante replied, his hand falling away, though his eyes remained locked on hers. "But understand that time is a luxury the Lombardis may not grant us. Every day you're exposed is a day they could strike." As if summoned by his words, Dante's iPhone buzzed. He glanced at it, his expression hardening. "What is it?" Sarah asked, fear clutching at her chest. "Marcus was just spotted 3 blocks from Tommy's school. He's looking for you. And he's not being subtle about it." The fear transformed into cold fury. Whatever else she might feel about Dante's proposal, whatever reservations she had about marrying a Mafia boss, one thing was crystal clear. She would do whatever necessary to protect her son. "How soon can we make this marriage happen?" Sarah heard herself ask. Dante's eyes flashed with something that looked like triumph and relief mixed together. "I can have everything arranged by tomorrow. Judge, paperwork, all of it." "Then do it," Sarah said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Marry me, Dante Caruso. Make us part of your family. Protect my son. And you," Dante added quietly. "I'll protect you too, Sarah." She nodded, not trusting her voice to acknowledge the promise in his words. Because she was already protected, in ways that had nothing to do with legal documents or family names. She was protected by the fierce determination in Dante's eyes, by the way he dropped everything to answer her desperate phone call, by the promise he'd made to a 7-year-old boy in a hospital waiting room. She was protected by something far more dangerous than marriage contracts or family alliances. She was protected by Dante Caruso's obsession with keeping his word, and God help anyone who tried to prove him wrong. The wedding took place in Dante's study exactly 26 hours after Sarah had agreed to his proposal. No guests except Gabriella and Vincent as witnesses, no flowers or music or any of the trappings Sarah had once imagined for this moment. Just a judge who owed Dante favors, paperwork that made her legally Sarah Caruso, and a man who slid a platinum wedding band onto her finger with hands that had killed but held hers with surprising gentleness. Tommy watched from a chair pulled up beside them, his expression serious as he witnessed his mother marry a man who'd saved her life twice now. When the judge pronounced them husband and wife, Tommy didn't wait for permission before launching himself at Dante. "Does this mean you're my dad now?" Tommy asked, his voice muffled against Dante's chest. Sarah's breath caught, waiting for Dante to correct him, to establish boundaries around what this marriage really meant. Instead, Dante knelt so he was eye level with Tommy. "That's up to you. I can't replace your father, but I can promise to protect you and your mother for as long as I live, to make sure you're safe, educated, cared for. If you want to call me Dad, I'd be honored." Tommy's face crumpled, tears streaming down his cheeks. "I want to call you Dad. My real dad hurt my mom and scared me, but you saved her. You kept your promise." Dante pulled Tommy into a fierce hug, and Sarah saw something she never expected to see on the face of a Mafia boss: tears. "Then I'm your dad now," Dante said thickly. "And that means I'll always keep my promises to you. Both of you." When Dante stood, still holding Tommy, his eyes found Sarah's. The intensity there made her knees weak. This was supposed to be a practical arrangement, a legal solution to a dangerous problem. But the way Dante looked at her, with Tommy in his arms and a wedding ring on his finger, spoke of something far more complicated than convenience. 6 weeks later, the confrontation with the Lombardis came on a Tuesday afternoon, in a warehouse on the south side that had once been the site of Sarah's overheard conversation. Dante had arranged the meeting with strategic precision, bringing enough firepower to discourage violence but not so much that it would look like provocation. Vincent stood at his right hand, and 3 other men Sarah had learned to recognize as Dante's most trusted enforcers flanked them. Sarah watched from the car. Despite Dante's initial protests, she'd insisted on being present. on, facing the men who'd terrorized her rather than hiding while others fought her battles. This ends today. Dante's voice carried through the open warehouse doors, echoing off metal rafters. Sarah Caruso is under my family's protection. Any further moves against her will be considered an act of war against the Caruso organization. Anthony Lombardi, the head of his family, stood across from Dante with his own contingent of armed men. He was older, 60 at least, with the kind of face that had seen too much violence to be moved by threats. You married a witness to protect her, Anthony said, his voice carrying disbelief and grudging respect. That's a new one. Even for you, Caruso. I married a woman who was threatened for doing nothing more than existing in the wrong space at the wrong time, Dante corrected. Your enforcer Romano was sloppy. That's not Sarah's fault. She could still testify. She could, Dante agreed. But anything she says now would be tainted by her connection to me. No prosecutor would trust testimony from a mob wife. You know that as well as I do. Anthony was quiet for a long moment, calculating. Sarah could see the moment he decided the fight wasn't worth it, that eliminating one witness wasn't worth starting a war with the Caruso family. Your wife stays out of our business, Anthony said finally, and we forget she exists. Agreed, Dante replied. Provided your man Marcus Mitchell stays away from her as well. Permanently. Marcus is a loose end, Anthony admitted. Consider him handled. The words were casual, but Sarah understood the implications. Marcus, her abusive ex-husband, the man who'd terrorized her and Tommy, would be eliminated. The thought should have horrified her. Instead, she felt only relief. Dante returned to the car minutes later, sliding into the seat beside her. It's done. You're safe. Tommy's safe. Sarah let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Just like that? Just like that, Dante confirmed. The Lombardis won't risk war over a witness who can't hurt them. And Marcus won't be a problem anymore, because you're having him killed, Sarah said quietly. Dante didn't flinch from the truth. Because a threat to my family is being permanently removed. That's what I do, Sarah. That's who I am. She should have been revolted. Should have demanded he find another way. But after weeks of fear, of looking over her shoulder, of watching Tommy flinch at sudden noises, Sarah found she couldn't summon outrage at the elimination of a man who'd beaten her and terrorized their son. I know who you are, Sarah said, reaching for his hand. And I'm choosing to stay anyway. Something shifted in Dante's expression, walls crumbling to reveal vulnerability he rarely showed. Sarah, I'm not saying it's going to be easy, she interrupted. I'm not saying I understand this world, or that I'll ever be comfortable with the violence, but you've kept every promise you made. You've protected us. You've given Tommy a father who treats him with gentleness and respect. And you've given me, she trailed off, searching for words. What? Dante asked softly. What have I given you? Safety, Sarah replied. Not just physical safety, though that matters, but the safety to breathe without fear, to wake up without wondering if today's the day Marcus breaks through my door, to imagine a future that extends beyond survival. Dante's hand cupped her face, thumb brushing across her cheekbone. I want to give you more than safety, Sarah. I want to give you everything. Then start with this, Sarah whispered, leaning into his touch. Start with being here, being real, being the man who drops everything when a child asks for help. That's all I need. When Dante kissed her, it was nothing like the perfunctory kiss they'd shared at their wedding. This was heat and promise, and the breaking of barriers they'd both maintained for 6 weeks of living as married strangers. This was the beginning of something real. 3 months later, Sarah stood in the kitchen of the mansion that had become home, teaching Tommy how to make her grandmother's chocolate chip cookies. The kitchen was absurdly oversized for a family of 3, but Mrs. Chen had assured her that Mr. Caruso had insisted Sarah have access to any cooking equipment she might want. It was one of many small gestures Dante made that showed he'd been paying attention. The coffee maker that produced exactly the kind of dark roast she preferred. The books that appeared on her nightstand, titles she'd mentioned wanting to read. The therapy appointments he'd arranged for Tommy to help process the trauma of Marcus's abuse. Dad says, if I get good at baking, I can help Mrs. Chen make his birthday cake, Tommy announced, carefully measuring flour into the bowl. Dad. Tommy had fully embraced Dante in that role, following him around the estate whenever possible, listening with rapt attention to stories Dante told about growing up in Chicago. Dante, in turn, had stepped into fatherhood with unexpected grace, attending Tommy's school events, helping with homework, even coaching his newly joined soccer team. "Your dad has excellent taste," Sarah replied, smiling at how naturally the word came now. "You're calling him my dad now too," Tommy observed, too perceptive for his age. "Does that mean you like him? Like him? Sarah felt heat rise to her cheeks. In the 3 months since their strategic marriage, the relationship between her and Dante had evolved in ways she couldn't have predicted. Long conversations after Tommy went to bed, shared meals where they talked about everything from books to philosophy to their complicated childhoods, stolen kisses in hallways that left her breathless and wanting more. "Yes," Sarah admitted. "I like him. Tommy grinned. "Good. He smiles more when you're around, and he doesn't look so sad when he thinks nobody's watching. Out of the way, to mouths of babes." Tommy had noticed what Sarah had been slowly realizing. That Dante had been lonely. That his empire and power had isolated him from genuine connection. That underneath the dangerous exterior was a man who wanted the same things most people wanted. Family, belonging, love. "What are we talking about?" Dante's voice came from the doorway, and Sarah turned to find him leaning against the frame, suit jacket discarded, and shirt sleeves rolled up. "How you smile more now," Tommy announced with the brutal honesty of childhood. "Because you're not lonely anymore." Dante's eyes met Sarah's, something soft and vulnerable passing between them. "No," he agreed quietly. "I'm not lonely anymore." That night, after Tommy was tucked into bed with his usual request for one more story, Sarah found Dante in his study, papers spread across his desk. "Working late?" she asked from the doorway. He looked up, his expression warming when he saw her. "Always. Running an empire requires constant attention." Sarah moved into the room, settling onto the leather couch that had become her favorite spot for reading. "Tommy asked me today if I liked you." Liked you?" Dante's lips kirked. "And what did you tell him?" "The truth," Sarah replied. "That I do." Dante set down his pen, giving her his full attention. "Sarah, I know what you're going to say," she interrupted. "That this marriage was supposed to be practical, that I shouldn't feel obligated, that you'll understand if I want to maintain distance." "Actually," Dante said, standing and moving toward her, "I was going to say that I've fallen in love with you." The words hit Sarah like lightning. In all their conversations, all their stolen moments of intimacy, neither had voiced the feeling that had been growing between them like wildfire. "I love the way you read to Tommy with different voices for each character," Dante continued, sitting beside her on the couch. "I love how you've transformed this house, from a fortress into a home. I love your strength, your courage, the way you refuse to be a victim, even when circumstances tried to make you one." He took her hands in his. "I love you, Sarah. Not because I saved you, not because we're married, but because you remind me every day that there's more to life than power and control. You make me want to be better than what I am." Sarah felt tears spill over, emotions too big to contain. "I love you too," she whispered, "and that terrifies me." "Why?" Dante asked gently, brushing away her tears with his thumbs. "Because loving you means accepting your world, the violence, the danger, the impossible choices. I don't know if I'm strong enough for that." "You're strong enough for anything," Dante said with absolute conviction. "You survived an abusive marriage, raised a son alone, built a life from nothing, and faced down men who wanted you dead. If that's not strength, I don't know what is." "I didn't do it alone," Sarah corrected. 7-year-old boy grabbed your sleeve and begged you to save his mother. And you did. You keep saving us." "Then let me keep saving you," Dante murmured, his forehead resting against hers. "Let me love you without conditions or expiration dates. Let me give you and Tommy the life you deserve." When Sarah kissed him, it was with the full weight of acceptance. Not just acceptance of his proposal or his protection, but acceptance of the man himself. Dangerous, complicated, capable of terrible things, but also of fierce tenderness and unwavering loyalty. "Yes," she breathed against his lips. "Yes to all of it." 1 year later, the charity gala Dante had organized to benefit children's health care filled the grand ballroom of Chicago's most prestigious hotel. Sarah stood beside him in a gown he'd had custom made, her hand resting in the crook of his arm as they greeted guests. She'd learned to navigate this world over the past year, learned which conversations to participate in, and which to deflect. Learned to read the subtle power dynamics between families who smiled at each other in public while plotting in private. Learned that being Dante's wife meant being both protected and scrutinized in equal measure. But she'd also learned that Dante's power could be used for good. The foundation they'd established together provided medical care to families who couldn't afford it, ensuring no other child would watch their parents suffocate in a waiting room because help was too expensive. "Mommy, Dad says I can help serve dessert," Tommy announced, appearing in a miniature tuxedo that made him look impossibly grown up. At 8, he'd grown 3 inches and lost the haunted look that had shadowed him during the Marcus years. "Just make sure you don't eat all the cannoli before the guests get any," Sarah teased, straightening his bow tie. "I promise nothing," Tommy replied with a grin that was pure joy, then scampered off toward the kitchen where Mrs. Chen was coordinating the catering staff. "He's happy," Dante observed, watching Tommy disappear into the crowd. "That's what matters most." "We're all happy," Sarah corrected, squeezing his arm. "You gave us that." "You gave me everything," Dante countered. "A reason to build instead of just control. A family that's more than strategic alliances and blood ties. A home instead of a fortress." The past year had transformed all of them. Dante still ran his empire, still made impossible choices and wielded power that most people couldn't comprehend. But he came home to family dinners and Tommy's soccer games. He read bedtime stories and planned vacations. He'd found balance between the man he'd been forced to become and the man he wanted to be. As the evening wound down and guests began to depart, Sarah found herself standing on the balcony overlooking the Chicago skyline. The city glittered like scattered diamonds, beautiful and dangerous in equal measure. Dante joined her, his jacket draped over her shoulders, against the autumn chill. "What are you thinking about?" "About how different my life is from a year ago," Sarah replied. "About how one moment of desperation, Tommy, grabbing a stranger's sleeve, changed everything. Do you regret it?" Dante asked quietly. "Any of it?" Sarah turned to face him. This dangerous, complicated man who'd become her husband, her protector, her partner in building something real from the wreckage of their separate pasts. "Not for a second," she said truthfully. "You kept your promise to Tommy. You saved us. And somehow, along the way, we saved you too." Dante pulled her close, his arms wrapping around her with the fierce protectiveness that had defined their relationship from the beginning. "Then we're even." "No," Sarah disagreed, tilting her face up to kiss him. "We're family. And family doesn't keep score." As they stood together overlooking the city, Dante commanded through fear and respect. Sarah marveled at the impossible journey that had brought them. From a hospital waiting room, where a desperate child had grabbed a stranger's sleeve, to a life built on promises kept and love earned through action rather than words. She'd married a Mafia boss to survive. But somewhere along the way, she'd fallen in love with the man beneath the reputation. The man who read bedtime stories in funny voices and made sure she had her favorite coffee every morning. The man who'd kept his word to a 7-year-old boy and built a family from the broken pieces of their separate traumas. Inside the ballroom, she could hear Tommy's laughter as he helped serve dessert, his joy infectious and pure. He'd asked a powerful man to save his mother, and that man had delivered more than survival. He'd delivered hope, safety, family, love. And in Dante Caruso's arms, overlooking a city that bent to his will but couldn't touch what they'd built together, Sarah finally understood what it meant to be home. Not a place, not a house, but the space between heartbeats, where 3 broken people had found each other and decided to be whole. Epilogue: 2 years later, the nursery was painted in soft yellows and whites, gender neutral because Sarah and Dante had decided to be surprised. Tommy sat in the rocking chair, practicing holding a baby doll with the serious concentration of a big brother in training. "When she gets here," Tommy said, he decided the baby was a girl, despite everyone's insistence they didn't know yet. "I'm going to teach her all the important stuff, like how to make Dad smile and how to ask Mom for cookies before dinner." Sarah laughed from her position on the bed, 36 weeks pregnant and counting down the days. "Those are definitely critical life skills." Dante entered with a tray of food, his hovering having reached new heights as her due date approached. He'd rearranged his entire schedule to work from home, delegated more responsibilities to Vincent, and generally driven Sarah crazy with his protective instincts. "She needs to eat," Dante announced, setting the tray beside her. "And rest. The doctor said I'm perfectly healthy and the baby is fine," Sarah interrupted fondly. "You need to relax before you give yourself an ulcer." "Relaxing is not in my skill set," Dante replied, but he sat on the edge of the bed, his hand automatically moving to rest on her swollen belly. The baby kicked in response to his touch, making him smile with the wonder that never seemed to fade. This man who commanded fear and respect across an entire city turned to putty at the feel of his unborn child moving beneath his palm. "She likes you," Tommy observed. "She's going to be a daddy's girl." "She's going to be loved," Dante corrected. "By all of us." Sarah watched the two of them, her husband and the son he'd claimed as his own, and felt her heart swell with gratitude for the strange, unexpected path that had brought them here. 3 years ago, she'd been drowning, suffocating in a hospital waiting room, while the system that was supposed to help her simply made her wait her turn. Tommy had grabbed a stranger's sleeve in desperate hope, and that stranger had turned out to be salvation in expensive Italian tailoring. Dante had kept his promise, protected them, loved them, given Tommy a father who treated him with respect and gentleness, given Sarah a partnership built on mutual respect and earned trust. And now they were expanding their family, bringing new life into a world Dante was systematically making safer for those he loved. "What are you thinking about?" Dante asked, catching her expression. "About promises kept," Sarah replied, lacing her fingers through his. "About how sometimes the scariest thing that can happen is a child asking a dangerous man for help. And sometimes that dangerous man turns out to be exactly what that child needed." "I'm not dangerous," Dante protested mildly. "I'm protective. There's a difference." Tommy snorted. "Dad, everyone at Rated School knows you're scary, but they also know you coach soccer and make really good pancakes. It's confusing for them." "Good," Dante said with satisfaction. "I enjoy being confusing." That night, after Tommy was asleep and the house had settled into its usual quiet, Sarah found Dante in the nursery, standing over the crib they'd assembled together. "Having second thoughts?" she teased, leaning against the doorway. "Having all the thoughts," Dante admitted. "What if I'm not good enough? What if I can't protect her the way I should? What if you're exactly the father she needs?" Sarah interrupted, moving to his side. "Just like you're exactly the father Tommy needs. Just like you're exactly the husband I need." Dante pulled her close, careful of her belly, his chin resting on top of her head. 3 years ago, a little boy grabbed my sleeve and asked me to save his mother. I thought I was just helping with a medical emergency. And instead, Sarah prompted. "Instead, I saved myself," Dante replied quietly. "You and Tommy, you gave me something to protect that mattered more than territory or power. You gave me a reason to be more than what I'd become." "We gave each other that," Sarah corrected. "You gave us safety and security. We gave you family and purpose. It's not one-sided, Dante. It never was." The baby kicked again, as if agreeing, and they both laughed at the timing. "She's going to be just like you," Dante said, his hand moving to where the baby had kicked. "Strong and fierce and completely unimpressed by my reputation." "Or she'll be just like Tommy," Sarah suggested, brave enough to grab a stranger's sleeve when it matters most. "Either way," Dante murmured, "she'll be loved. Completely, absolutely, without reservation." It was a promise. Another in a long line of promises Dante Caruso had made to Sarah and Tommy. Promises he'd kept with unwavering dedication. And as Sarah stood in the nursery with her husband, carrying their daughter, and thinking about the son sleeping peacefully down the hall, she understood with absolute certainty that some promises were worth everything. Some promises changed lives. And some promises, made by desperate children to dangerous men in hospital waiting rooms, became the foundation of families built on love earned through action, through choice, through the daily decision to be present and protective and real. Tommy had grabbed a Mafia boss's sleeve and cried, "Save my mommy, she can't breathe." And Dante Caruso had done exactly that. He'd saved them all. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.